Hello, everyone. Welcome back and welcome to this session, Pathways to a Sustainable and Desirable Future at this year's World Aquatic Animal Day on Disentangling the Sustainability Myth in Fishing and Aquaculture. This is a project of the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative and the Animal Law Clinic here at Lewis and Clark. My name is Kathy Hessler and I'm director of those programs. And I'm extremely excited to have our guest speakers for this panel, Miranda Eisen and Andrew Crump, with us today. This panel will be exploring different methods of advocacy to dispel the myth that aquaculture and wild caught fishing are sustainable business practices and to advocate for the health and well-being of aquatic animals. Before we dive into the session, a couple quick reminders. This is a Zoom webinar format, so you won't be able to see yourself, just the speakers, and you'll be muted, but you can submit your questions and comments, and we encourage you to do that through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We are recording this session and hope that all recorded sessions will be available in a few weeks, and you can check our website, worldaquaticanimalday.org. And there's a lot of information there if you have other questions. And if you're posting on social media, we have a hashtag, hashtag World Aquatic Animal Day. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our wonderful speakers. Miranda Eisen is a third-year law student here at Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon, in the US. She's currently completing her certification in animal law and has a special passion for advocating for aquatic animals through the law. Miranda has worked on so many things here at the law school, and I've been pleased that she's worked with me for a couple of years, and I've benefited from her energy, passion, and intelligence. She's also interned with a number of animal protection organizations, including Animal Equality, Mercy for Animals, Rise for Animals, the Humane Society of the US, and Animal Legal Defense Fund, and she's been an important student leader here at the school. Our other speaker is Dr. Andrew Crump, who is a biologist fascinated by animal consciousness, including questions such as why did it evolve, which animals have it, what does it mean for welfare, and he is currently searching for indicators of consciousness in invertebrate animals as part of the Foundations of Animal Sentience project based at the London School of Economics, which some of our other speakers have already referred to. Before that, Andrew completed a PhD in animal cognition, behavior, and welfare at Queen's University, Belfast. So that's it. I'll pass it over to Miranda and then Andrew, and I'll see folks for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for that wonderful introduction. I am going to share my screen. So if you will just wait one moment. Here we go. Okay, that looks pretty good. So as Kathy mentioned, my name is Miranda Eisen. I'm a third-year law student at Lewis and Clark Law School. My pronouns are she, her, and I am here to talk to you today about the many ways that folks are advocating to make the world a more humane and sustainable place for aquatic animals. I'll be providing a generalized overview of different methods of advocacy with examples interspersed throughout so that you can get an idea of the progress that's been made while keeping in mind the many opportunities for you to get involved and keep this world changing for the better. So as we dive in, I want to provide the general categories of advocacy that will structure the conversation today. We'll cover legal campaigns, scientific research, corporate outreach, and social campaigns. Each of these methods of advocacy plays a crucial role in dismantling oppressive systems and building up new frameworks of justice. And although they differ in substance and approach, they build on each other to make tangible improvements for aquatic animals. Let's begin with legal campaigns, which entail strategic advancement of social change goals through the legislative, judicial, regulatory, and policymaking systems. So what does that actually look like, right? It can look like a few different things. I'm just going to X out of this chat box real fast. There we go. So first off, legislative campaigns. Advancing social change through the legislative process takes on many forms, but generally speaking, it's considered the process of using your voice as an individual or group to influence government policy. Legislative advocacy can be as simple as sending an email or calling the office of your local representatives, and as grand as running a full-fledged campaign to write, lobby for, and amend existing legislation or pass new legislation. In the US, passing legislation to protect aquatic animals, as folks have already illuminated for us today, has been an uphill battle. Aquatic animals are excluded from most US laws that protect animals, including criminal state anti-cruelty laws, slaughter laws, transportation laws, and research and captive animal laws. But that doesn't and shouldn't stop advocates from trying to enact such legislation. For example, in the last few years, the Florida Orchid Protection Act was introduced in the US state of Florida to make it illegal to hold orcas in captivity. Although this bill did not pass, important strides have been made for orcas recently, including the famous killer whale Lolita in the Miami Seaquarium, no longer having to perform, which only fuels the fire to keep on proposing new legislative initiatives. Legislative campaigns can also help aquatic animals by protecting aquatic environments. So China's Marine Environment Protection Law is a great example of something that does just that by providing a legal framework for preventing marine pollution and improving marine ecological environments. The second major legal advocacy tactic is litigation-based advocacy. Animal law litigators rely on existing statutes and common law rulings to file lawsuits and thereby create new rights and protections for aquatic animals. A great example of this is a 2002 US case where the Center for Biological Diversity filed suit against the National Science Foundation to enjoin the foundation's acoustical research in the Gulf of California. The National Science Foundation used air guns to fire extremely high energy acoustic bursts into the ocean, which was shown to cause significant injury to marine mammals. The court found that any injury or harassment to marine mammals in the course of the research project would violate the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is a federal law prohibiting the harassment, hunting, or killing of marine mammals without a permit, as mentioned a little bit today. So that's just a quick little glimpse at litigation. A field of advocacy that often overlaps with litigation is administrative advocacy on the federal, state, and local level. Administrative law regulates the operation and procedures of government agencies. In the US, relevant agencies that have already been mentioned a little bit today include the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is referred to as NOAA, the US Department of Agriculture, the USDA, the US Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and also the US Fish and Wildlife Service, or FWS. Agencies such as these promulgate regulations, which are rules that government agencies put in place to implement statutory law. Advocates can influence the formation or application of these rules to improve or save the lives of aquatic animals. So for example, advocates can help ensure that the protections outlined for threatened aquatic species under the US Endangered Species Act are in fact being protected to the best of our government's ability. Ooh, it looks like I'm missing a slide here. So sorry about that. But something else I wanted to definitely mention is public policy advocacy, which encompasses a wide range of activities that influence decision makers. And legislative work, as previously discussed, so I'll hop back to that one real quick, is one manner in which to implement policy change. But public policy is much broader than just legislative campaigning. Public policy is the process of initiating and negotiating dialogues through which influential networks, opinion leaders, and decision makers take your ideas and make them a reality. This means public policy advocacy can look like educating the public and garnering support, building relationships with industry stakeholders, and lobbying relevant decision makers. So there is a lot of overlap with legislative campaigning, but it's a little bit broader than that. And a key example of a public policy campaign in the aquatic animal space is the campaign to stop the fledgling octopus aquaculture industry, which Jennifer Jacquet mentioned this morning, which has included publishing reports, writing to governmental bodies, and around the world, basically, urging them to prevent industry development and persuading influential food companies to seriously consider the risks associated with intensive octopus farming and basically trying to steer them away from it. And lastly, of these 4, in terms of legal campaigns, or 5, there are legal campaigns to unite countries under shared goals of protecting our oceans and their inhabitants, so taking an international approach. Countries from around the world have signed treaties and conventions, which are legal mechanisms available in the international law context, that allow us to advocate for marine life. A great example of this is the agreement to promote compliance with international conservation and management measures by fishing vessels on the high seas. This agreement set out principles and international standards of behavior for more responsible practices for effective conservation, management, and development of living aquatic resources. 45 parties, including countries like Argentina, Egypt, Japan, and Sweden, agreed to take necessary measures to ensure that fishing vessels that are entitled to fly their flag do not engage in activity that undermines the effectiveness of international conservation and management measures. The second category of advocacy we're exploring today is scientific research. So what does that actually look like? Animal scientists have made remarkable strides in the last few decades in proving that many aquatic animal species are sentient, vital to the ecosystems that they inhabit, and that the pollution and excessive exploitation that accompanies fishing and aquaculture have detrimental impacts on humans and animals' ability to thrive on Earth. Advocates of all kinds use these scientifically significant findings to lobby for legislation, strengthen arguments in court, and develop management and production practices that safeguard aquatic animals and their homes. Andrew Crump, my fellow panelist here with me today, will shortly be showcasing recent successes in the English Parliament due to his extensive and influential research on animal sentience. So we can all look forward to getting more in-depth look on this particular prong of advocacy in just a few minutes. Next is corporate outreach. Advocates working within corporate outreach can do a number of things, including ensuring companies are complying with existing animal protection laws and also encouraging businesses to implement meaningful protections to reduce the suffering of aquatic animals. Corporate outreach advocates communicate directly with fishing and aquaculture industry players to convince them that it is in their best interest to willingly change their internal production methods and procedures. Such advocates often narrow in on specific requests, such as adopting improved standards of care, enhancing certification requirements, and offering plant-based alternatives. Lastly, we have social campaigns as a tool for change. Social campaigns are a method of mobilizing individuals and groups to take action for aquatic animals. Such actions can include a variety of tactics, like initiating a letter writing campaign against a local fishery or aquarium, collecting signatures for petitions, and coordinating social media campaigns to pressure relevant targets. An excellent example of the power of social organizing is the movement to end the breeding and captivity of orcas in aquariums and marine parks. A 2013 documentary entitled Blackfish, in conjunction with mass calls of action on social media and in person, led SeaWorld's stock market price to drastically fall, and the state of California to pass a bill prohibiting killer whale captivity, breeding, and trade. This public education and pressure campaign created substantive legal and industry improvements for orcas in the US, indicating the power social campaigns have to make change for aquatic animals. The methods of advocacy that were discussed today provide only a glimpse into the different ways advocates are currently fighting for aquatic animals. We've made tremendous progress in the last half century to promote the well-being of aquatic life, but I hope that you take the information learned about today to continue fighting for a healthier and more humane world for aquatic animals. And know that no matter what your skill set is, what your interests are, you have a place in making sure that the world is a better place for aquatic animals. So thank you so much for your time, and I will pass the mic to my colleague, Andrew Crump, to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Miranda. That was brilliant. And also thank you to both you and Kathy for your very kind words about our work. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see that okay?
Perfect.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so, and also thank you, of course, to Lewis and Clark for organizing this wonderful event and for inviting me to talk. I'm going to be addressing quite a controversial topic here, which Miranda very helpfully introduced by talking about the science of animal sentience. So I'm going to be talking about lobsters, crabs, and octopuses probably feeling pain. The reason for that is that I think this is a great example of evidence-based policy making here in the UK, which I've been very proud to be a very small part of. So first of all, what is sentience? I use pain in the title of these kind of presentations because people sort of readily understand and know what pain is. But there's this kind of broader category of sentient experiences, which includes pain, which is perhaps a bit more difficult to define. But essentially, it's a really simple concept. It's just the capacity to have feelings. If something feels good or bad, then it's a sentient experience. And that's crucial that there are both the good and the bad here, because often animal welfare law tends to focus on things like suffering and pain, the bad side of experiences. But actually imagine your life if you only had minimized pain and suffering. If you didn't have anything positive, it probably wouldn't be a particularly good or fulfilling life. So animal welfare scientists and legal scholars are increasingly prioritizing positive experiences, things like joy and curiosity and comfort. Giving animals these kind of positive things also matters, as well as minimizing the negative. So when we talk about sentience and whether animals are sentient, that simply means the capacity to have feelings. It's also often put in terms of consciousness or awareness, but sentience typically refers to kind of the most basic levels of those. So no ability to reflect on feelings, just simply, do I feel good or bad? So why does sentience matter? I should say at this point, I'm a biologist, I'm not an ethicist, and I'm not a legal scholar. But I think it's pretty intuitive why sentience matters, really. This is a very overused quote by Jeremy Bentham, but it's overused because it's accurate. This was a footnote in some of Bentham's work. And in it, he was basically addressing the question of who should be subjects of moral concern. And so he asks, what is it that should trace the insuperable line? And he says, the question is not, can they reason? It's not about intelligence. We don't base how we treat humans on how intelligent they are. Nor can they talk. Again, you know, we treat babies and we treat people who are developmentally disabled with basic dignity. The question, according to Bentham, is can they suffer? And we've now probably broadened that more to, are they sentient? So do they have this capacity to feel good and bad? And the example I often use is to compare a dog and a banana here. So if it's not kind of intuitively clear to you that sentience matters, I would say that if you watch me on this video hitting a dog over the head with a hammer, you'd probably mind, and you'd probably say I was doing something bad to the dog. Whereas if I were to hit a banana with a hammer, you might think I'm a bit weird, but you probably wouldn't think I'm doing something inherently wrong to the banana. And I think that just illustrates that dividing line that most people think a dog is probably sentient and a banana probably isn't. So for ethical reasons, sentience is really crucial. Building on that kind of ethical foundation, sentience is really important increasingly socially and politically. So countries that like to see themselves as leading the world in animal welfare legislation are increasingly and explicitly recognizing animals as sentient beings. So the Animal Welfare Act in Australia, the Lisbon Treaty, which is one of the core treaties of the European Union, recognizes animals as sentient beings. Quebec has recognized animals as sentient beings rather than mere objects. And then the Animal Welfare Act 1999, which is New Zealand legislation. So increasingly, animals are legally recognized as sentient. Now, that's not a cure-all, it's not perfect. Many of the laws recognizing animals as sentient don't, for example, define what they mean by sentience. And often they actually have fairly limited, if any, impacts on actual animal welfare. But I still believe that it's an important first step to say that there is something fundamentally different between a dog and a banana. I stuck this slide in just to sort of give lip service to the supposed topic of this session, sustainability. But animal welfare is crucial for sustainability. I believe that. It's actually not recognized explicitly in the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, but that's now been recognized by the UN itself as one of the major missions of the goals. It's especially surprising since several of these goals reflect kind of the importance of biodiversity conservation, but none of them explicitly talk about individual animals. The ones that kind of come closest, I guess, are Goal 12, responsible consumption and production. And some people have kind of added agricultural animal welfare into that. And relevantly today, Goal 14, life below water. So again, some people have said that that relates to the welfare of aquatic animals. But it's not currently recognized, but I still think that it's important for sustainability that our farming systems or that our food production systems don't just trample over any and all animal welfare concerns. Okay, so I quite like talking about US law. It's not something I know a huge amount about, but it's quite a good example of, from my perspective as a biologist, of how not to do things. So federal law doesn't legally define animals as sentient, although it does recognize that they suffer. So my issue with it is not so much that it doesn't recognize animals as sentient, because it kind of implicitly recognizes that by talking about suffering and pain. My issue with it primarily is about the scope. So these images illustrate some of the perhaps contradictions of the scope of the Animal Welfare Act in the US. So a horse is considered within the scope of the Act if it's outside of research purposes, but not within the scope of the Act. Sorry, if it is considered within the scope of the Act, if it's used for research purposes, but it's outside the scope of the Act if it's used for other purposes. So you could have the same horse, but if it's being mistreated by a scientist, that falls under the scope of the Act. And if it's being mistreated by, say, a stud farmer, it's not covered by the Act at all. That's not really a good scientific judge of whether that animal is having poor welfare or is not sentient. The situation is flipped around for rodents. So guinea pigs, for example, are covered by the Animal Welfare Act, but rats, laboratory rats used for research purposes are not. So again, there's no biological reason to say that rats aren't sentient, but guinea pigs are. Rats don't have welfare needs, but guinea pigs are. It's just a compromise between human stakeholders. There's nothing absolutely wrong with that. Obviously, animal welfare law, to some extent, has to take into account human needs. But I think that it's probably better to explicitly address that rather than try and develop these really weird definitions of animal like the Animal Welfare Act has tried to. So moving to the context in which I've worked, the UK did recognise animals as sentient beings under the Lisbon Treaty until Brexit, and then the UK Parliament decided not to carry over that particular clause into UK law. So although the UK government has made repeated loud claims that one of the key benefits of Brexit is that we can improve animal welfare, and that we're a world leader in this area, we haven't actually recognised animals as sentient beings for the last few years. And so the government basically wanted to change that with this new key piece of legislation. So this real flagship piece of legislation from this parliament, which is called the Animal Welfare Sentience Bill. And it does lots of different things, or it would do lots of different things if it passes. But one of the key ones is that it recognizes animals as sentient beings and would set up an animal sentience committee. And basically what this would do is it would be a panel of experts, and its job would be to advise the government in any future laws and how they might relate to animal welfare. It wouldn't actually have binding recommendations. The most power it had would really be to drag the relevant Secretary of State in front of the committee for questions. But in terms of generating publicity, that's probably still some level of power. But again, like with the US Animal Welfare Act, we come up against this question of scope. Where do we draw the line when it comes to defining animal? I, as a biologist, would say it's a metazoan, so it goes to everything, including like kind of jellyfishes and sponges. But I would also say that these are animals which don't have brains. It's at least debatable whether they even have a nervous system. And so they're probably not sentient. We probably shouldn't be worrying too much about their welfare needs. And so where do we draw that sentience line? That's a shockingly difficult question given the amount of research interest in it. And currently in the UK, our welfare laws aren't very helpful because they're already quite inconsistent when it comes to scope. So our Animal Welfare Act, for example, covers all vertebrates, but no invertebrates, whereas the legislation covering animals in science, it's called the ASPA, that covers all vertebrates and also cephalopod mollusks. So things like octopuses, cuttlefish, and squid. So there's already some level of inconsistency about what counts as an animal or a sentient animal in UK law. And so DEFRA are basically interested in whether two groups of animals, invertebrate animals, so animals without a backbone, should be included in this new animal sentience bill. The first is the decapod crustaceans, so lobsters, crabs, and prawns. And the second is those cephalopod mollusks. And this isn't just a kind of arcane academic discussion. It actually has potentially very serious ramifications for animal welfare, because these animals are routinely treated in ways that would be extremely inhumane if indeed they are sentient. So this image on the right here is a picture of a crab being boiled alive. Lobsters too are routinely boiled alive. The shellfish industry uses various practices when it comes to these animals, which would just not be considered remotely humane if they were done to sentient animals. And so that question of are they sentient and should they be included in welfare law is really quite an important one. So this is where my colleagues and I come in. because we basically applied for a tender that DEFRA, which is our Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, put out, because they wanted people working on animal sentience, and particularly invertebrate sentience, to advise the government on this question of scope. Should these decapod crustaceans and these cephalopod mollusks be included within the scope of the sentient bill? What's the kind of biological scientific consensus on whether they're sentient? And so my colleagues and I, we won this tender, and so we ended up writing a report. And here I should give a shout out to my co-authors, so Jonathan Birch and Heather Browning at the LSE, Charlotte Byrne at the Royal Veterinary College, and Alex Schnell at the University of Cambridge. Together, we wrote this absolutely mammoth 50,000-word report. If you want to read it, there's a link at the end. I don't necessarily recommend it. It is, at the very least, certainly the longest treatment of this issue ever written. But essentially, our job was to assess the evidence for pain and for suffering and for sentience in these animals. And so we had to develop various criteria for how you determine if an animal is sentient. And that is actually more difficult than it sounds. So when it comes to the capacity for pain experience, which is the main thing that we were asked to investigate, we have to distinguish between sentient pain, so that negative feeling associated with injury, and what's known as non-conscious nociception. So a really good way to illustrate this is with an example. So the classic one is that when you touch a hot stove and you pull your hand away, you actually pull your hand away before you feel the pain of the hot stove. So the reflexive response to the injury is called nociception, and then the pain is the conscious feeling that comes after that. And so if you just see evidence of an animal avoiding an injury, that doesn't actually tell you whether it feels pain, whether it's sentient, just tells you that it has that nociceptive reflex. And so when we're developing our criteria, we're trying to think of what are ways to show really flexible behaviors, which don't just reflect that nociceptive reflex, but which actually show the animal is experiencing pain. And to do that, we developed a diverse set of criteria. We wanted to cover physiology and the way that an animal's body is made up, but also cognition, so the way it processes information, and its behavior, to really attack the problem from multiple different angles. And so we came up with 8 criteria. I've been told I should say by when we've written articles or done interviews on this, that this is far and away the most boring part of my work. I apologize for that, but I do think it's quite important because it's basically the crux of our work. So we developed 8 criteria. The first 4 are related to how the nervous system functions, and they're designed to be quite general, but in the report itself, we go into much, much more detail about what they mean. So criterion 1 is that the animal possesses nociceptors. These are specialized cells which detect injury and only injury. So some cells detect injury and also other things, so say heat at various different temperatures, but nociceptive cells would only detect heat if it was at temperatures that were noxious. Criterion 2 is that the animal possesses integrative brain regions. Again, this is quite a general criterion as written, but in humans, for example, a key function of sentience is to combine information from multiple different sources. So for example, combining information from the auditory, so what you hear, and also visual realm. So being able to learn things that you hear and then apply them through vision. So if an animal can do a similar thing, for example, integrating different senses, and has regions of its brain that are capable of that, then that's potential evidence for sentience. Number 3 is just nervous connections between those two, so nociceptors and integrative brain regions. And then number 4 is that responses are affected by potential anesthetics and analgesics. So drugs and compounds, which in humans, for example, eliminate or alter sentient experience. If drugs have a similar effect on animals, that would also suggest that they have sentient experience, which is being altered. So those are the kind of criteria when it comes to the nervous system. We then also had 4 criteria when it came to behavior. So behaviors that indicate that an animal is showing more than just that nociceptive reflex, but actually has some sentient capacity for pain. So criteria number 5 is motivational trade-offs that show a balancing of threat against opportunity for reward. The reason we include this criteria is because if you have a reflex, so just that pulling your hand away from a hot stove, it's kind of the same every time because it's reflexive. You just always pull your hand away. But if you have a response which is based on sentient experience, you can balance different motivations against each other. So for example, if you've picked up a hot plate and it's your favorite plate, then if you're sentiently comparing the 2 motivations, one of which is don't drop the plate, but the other is pull your hand away, you might well be less inclined to pull your hand away than if you just were having that nociceptive reflex. So basically the ability to weigh different motivations against each other and to modulate that reflex is seen as some evidence of sentience. Number 6, flexible self-protective behaviors in response to injury and threat. Again, this is just evidence of flexibility in behavior, so not simple reflexive responses, but responses which are really directed, say, to the site of an injury. And again, we talk much more about that in the report about what that word flexible means and what kind of behaviors are covered. Number 7, associative learning. So this is the tendency of animals to associate a stimulus with something positive or negative. In humans, a key function of sentience seems to be to help with learning. We don't, in the criterion, outline the particular types of associative learning, and I'm not going to get into that now, which seem to be linked to consciousness, but again, we do that more in the report. And then finally, number 8, behavior showing that the animal values anesthetics and analgesics when injured. So this is very related to that criterion 4 about anesthetics and analgesics. And I don't have time, mercifully, to go into evidence for all of these in all of the animals that we looked at. But I thought I'd pick one example which relates to criterion 8 and also several of the other criteria, just to show what we think good evidence for pain in these invertebrate animals looks like. So this is an experiment by Robin Crook, who is a brilliant cephalopod researcher in San Francisco. And she basically had a very simple apparatus. It was basically letting an octopus into an area with several different chambers that the octopus could go into. And she started off by just seeing which chamber the octopus preferred. And then she saw how that changed depending on whether that preferred chamber was associated with a stimulus either noxious or neutral. So there were 3 conditions in this experiment, and they're shown by each of the columns on this figure. So the first one is a neutral stimulus. And in this case, basically when the octopus went into its preferred chamber, it just had some salt water injected into its arm. So not a painful stimulus at all. And what Robin Crook found was that the octopus then in subsequent trials just went back to the same chamber. It didn't affect which chambers the octopus preferred at all. The octopus paid no attention to its arms. There were no behavioral indicators of pain. And in terms of nervous activity between the arm and the brain, there was very little of that as well. So that was the control treatment in scientific terms. But then we get to the more interesting findings, which is that for a noxious stimulus, so if you inject acid into the arm of the octopus, so not salt water, but acid, something which we imagine to be painful, that did change the octopus's preferred chamber. So if you injected acid in the chamber that the octopus liked, it switched to the other chamber. So it affected its preference and the octopus learned to associate a chamber with that noxious stimulus. The octopuses also showed behavioral signs of pain, so things like grooming and skin removal, very closely targeted to the site where the noxious stimulus was presented. And there was also very high nervous activity between the arm and the brain. So clearly there are messages being transferred here, and it's being centrally processed. And then finally, and where things get, I think, really interesting, is that analgesics, so painkillers, seem to alleviate this effect. So in this time, this is the 3rd column on the image. Yes, again, the octopus avoided in subsequent trials that chamber where it had the noxious stimulus administered. But if you gave it the noxious stimulus along with a painkiller in the other chamber, it actually showed a preference for that noxious stimulus plus painkiller. And it also, again, like with the neutral stimulus, showed none of the behavioral signs of pain and none of the nervous signs of pain. So it seems like the noxious stimulus plus a painkiller actually seems to completely alleviate the effects of pain. So for us, this was really good evidence for potential pain in octopuses, suggesting that, yes, flexibly pain-inducing stimulus does seem to really influence their behavior and the way that their nervous system works, and that providing analgesics seems to completely abolish that effect. So we don't tend to talk about kind of definites here. We don't say that this is necessarily proof that octopuses feel pain. And that's why in my title, it's about they probably do. But we do think that studies like this suggest that these animals probably feel pain. And indeed, it should be worth noting that there's no, in a way, scientific proof that mammals, dogs, monkeys, that they feel pain either. So it's just increasing levels of proof. Increasing levels of likelihood. Okay, so in terms of what we found, well, we ended up reviewing over 300 scientific papers, things like the Robin Crook one. And then we arrived at a confidence level for each of our criteria based on the amount and quality of the evidence available. So how likely did we think it was that the animal in question met the criterion in question? And then we made an overall assessment of the likelihood that they are sentient based on how many criteria they satisfied with high confidence. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but if you're interested, please read the report. I'm just going to highlight some features. So this is our findings with regard to decapods. Along the top, you can see each of those 8 criteria, and then each of the different types of decapods down the side. And the criteria, if the animal has probably met it, it's given either high or very high confidence that it's met it. So those are the green boxes. So basically, the more green boxes here on each row, the more likely that that group of animals is sentient. So the first row is the true crabs, and they showed the most evidence of any of the decapod crustaceans. They showed either high or very high confidence in 5 of those criteria, which we considered strong evidence of sentience. But when you get further down the table, and this is where difficulties potentially start arising, you start to see fewer and fewer green boxes. So lobsters, for example, only fulfill 3, and the shrimps fulfill 2 for the Caridian shrimps, or only 1 for the Penaeid shrimps. This might look at first glance like, well, these shrimps probably aren't sentient then, but it's a bit more complicated than that, because actually it's just that they haven't been tested on most of these criteria. And absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. So when we're talking about defining the scope of policy, our view is that we need to make well-justified generalizations from well-studied groups, like in this case, the true crabs, to less studied relatives. And so for that reason, we recommend that although there's very little evidence in the shrimps, that they should still be protected until that evidence is gathered. And then these are the findings for cephalopods. I'm just going to talk about octopuses very quickly because they are spectacular. As far as invertebrates go, they are incredible learners, absolutely amazing cognitive abilities, and were far and away the standout of all the animals that we assessed. You can see that they fulfilled easily 7 of the 8 criteria, quite possibly fulfill the 8th as well. It's just there haven't been really good studies on them. And as you guys might know, if you've seen things like the documentary My Octopus Teacher, they just show really substantial evidence for sentience. But again, in the other groups of cephalopods, although cuttlefish and squid both score okay with 4 out of 8, it's not that where we have low or medium confidence that they've met a criterion that the evidence is there, but it's against them fulfilling it. It's more that they just haven't been studied. And so again, we think that well-justified generalizations are warranted to protect all of these animals and not just octopuses. So this leads to our central recommendation, and that was, I've printed out here, that we recommend that all cephalopod mollusks and all decapod crustaceans be regarded as sentient animals for the purposes of UK animal welfare law. And I'll also expand that to say I think that should not just be in the UK, but more generally. They should be counted as animals for the purposes of the Animal Welfare Act 2006, and included in the scope of any future legislation related to animal sentience. And like I say, there's a link to the report here. So basically, that was our recommendation, that these animals do have, that these animals are sentient, they do have welfare, and that we should be taking those needs into account. I didn't have enough time with this talk to go into particular practices involving these animals in aquaculture or in retail, but if you're interested in that, please do feel free to ask, because again, that's something that we offered quite a lot of advice on in the report. These recommendations were really picked up, quite surprisingly, internationally in the media, because very few countries currently do protect these animals in welfare law. And so it was seen as quite newsworthy that we as a group of scientists and philosophers who work in this area think that they should be protected. And so, like I said, we got international media coverage, and that was part of the reason why we had a really good outcome, which is that the UK government did ultimately amend the Animal Welfare Sentience Bill. So where it previously, the bill said that this bill applies to all vertebrate animals, it was subsequently amended to say also all cephalopod mollusks and all decapod crustaceans. It's still, I guess, not the end of the line for this, because actually there are lots more challenges ahead, I think. So even in the UK context, even though they included decapods and cephalopods in the Animal Sentience Bill, they're still not covered by the Animal Welfare Act or the Animals and Scientific Procedures Act or the Welfare of Animals at the Time of Killing Act. So there's lots of laws currently in the UK which the government apparently has no intention of amending, which do not cover these animals, even though hopefully very soon they're going to be legally recognized as sentient. So I think that's something for campaigners to focus on going forward, to actually achieve change in animal welfare. There's also, of course, other countries. Very few countries currently protect decapod crustaceans and cephalopod mollusks. And it is a big issue because I know that there was sort of talk about, say, orcas earlier. There are fewer than 100, certainly fewer than 1,000 orcas in the US. That's not an unimportant issue, but when we're talking about, say, decapod crustaceans, billions are slaughtered with absolutely no concern for their welfare whatsoever every year. So this is a huge welfare issue, which is almost completely neglected at the current time. And then finally, other species or other groups of animals. So in the UK, fish are covered by our Animal Welfare Act, but that's not the case in the US. I've included a picture of a bee here. I know that's not an aquatic animal, and I apologize, but I do a lot of work on bees, and I think they're wonderful and certainly amazing learning abilities, a good candidate potentially for sentience. And then gastropod mollusks. So now that the UK government has recognized cephalopod mollusks as sentient, to what extent does that apply to gastropods as well? So I'm going to leave it there. Again, apologies for not discussing kind of the practical implications of these kind of changes very much, but please do feel free to ask questions on that if you have any. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew and Miranda. And I know there'll be questions coming in, but to start with, we have questions about, for both of you, in slightly different perspectives. So how do you talk to the government officials or to the public, members of the public, about both science, Andrew, and about law, Miranda, given that they don't fully understand all of these things together? And the conversations that you presented us with have a very high level of information, and you don't always have, sometimes you have 5 minutes, right, to talk to someone. So Andrew, if you want to start with talking, your thoughts, any tips, and then we'll move to science, and then we'll move to Miranda about law. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not sure it's one that I'm that well qualified to answer, because I'm not sure I'm that good at it, because I tend to like to include at least the kind of fundamental science. When it comes to government, I think the key that we found is that if you give them a menu of different options, even if you make clear that you think that one of those options is best, they'll tend to go for the easiest. And that's especially true in something like kind of where the shellfish industry does have a lot of power. We've actually had some great engagement with the shellfish industry, and a lot of them are already doing the things that we're recommending. But other sort of stakeholders and other members of that industry aren't necessarily that keen on legislation covering these animals. So we tended in the report to basically do what we were asked by DEFRA to do, which is to say, there's controversy here, there's disagreements, but we as experts have this view, this is what we think you should do. And we basically settled on giving them one option, really, and just saying, in our opinion, this is what we think you should do. And in some cases, they followed that. So regarding these animals as sentient in the Sentience Bill, in other cases, they didn't. So amending the Animal Welfare Act or the ASPA. But I think by and large, that was probably the right approach, because I think if we had have offered multiple options, the kind of detail and reading the whole report would have probably been lost. So I think that's the case for government. I think for the general public, it depends on the audience. That I think generally speaking, we had some polling done actually in the UK on the public think that octopuses and lobsters are likely to be sentient. And I was shocked, because about 80% of the general public, before our report was published, thought that both lobsters and octopuses were sentient. So generally speaking, I have a much easier time convincing the general public of this sort of thing than lawmakers. And actually often it's normally me when I'm talking to the general public who, when the public is saying, oh, you've proved sentience in these animals, that's wonderful, I'm saying, well, no, it's all about probabilities and likelihoods and all those boring scientific answers. So yeah, I think it depends on the audience, but generally speaking, the public are much more open to this idea than lawmakers are.
Thanks. Yeah, Miranda.
Yeah, so I would say there's a lot of continuity between exactly what Andrew was saying and the legal space. So from a legislative standpoint, a big point of today is to be a source of education for folks, right? The greater public. And that goes for legislators as well. There's so many legislators who have no idea what is going on in the wild caught fishing industry, the aquaculture industry. So one of the most important steps is setting up opportunities for those folks to actually be able to understand the problem in the first place. It's hard to advocate for a problem that you that the recipient knows nothing about. So that's usually where we'll start, for whether it's an informational briefing, an informational hearing, or a legislative briefing, where you have opportunities to educate legislators in legislative spaces organized by legislators. So one of the harder parts is kind of getting a champion, someone who is already in the legislature, who knows your issue, or at least at the very least supports it, right? Wants to help with your issue. But I would say education is probably the biggest barrier. But at the same time, there's opposition as well, right? So not everyone's going to be on board, even if they understand the issue. So maybe they have close connections with folks in the industry. Maybe they represent a district in your state that's from the coast and cares about fishing and is worried about maybe some of the welfare implications in terms of how that's going to affect the bottom line of the industry. So there's a lot of considerations, but I think definitely from the legal standpoint, communicating exactly what Andrew was doing, right? So the science itself, putting that on the table, making sure that they actually know what the state of the science is and why we're here advocating for it. But then at the same time, another beautiful thing that Andrew was mentioning is there is actually a good amount of public understanding and support for this issue already. So really just communicating that to legislators as much as we can.
That's great. Thank you both. And the next question sort of follows on along the same lines, just in a different focus, and that is dealing with the absence of information. And so, as Andrew, you were talking about, especially with your slide, saying that we don't have proof. People tend to think, number one, that science has already done everything it needs to do. But then what does it mean to say we don't have proof? And the same thing, Miranda, or a similar thing in the law. People tend to think the laws are already existing to protect animals and that we already have some foundational or fundamental baseline set, and that's just not true. So how do you both sort of deal with, or suggest people deal with, that lack, right? That sort of hole in information and understanding and already activity. Andrew, do you want to start again?
Might be nice if Miranda goes first, so I can at least think of an answer.
Great. Okay.
I was thinking the same thing, Andrew. So I'll say what first comes to mind about this. So just generally speaking, I feel like animal law in general is a field that a lot of folks don't even know exist. They don't really understand the frameworks that are currently in place. And even if they know some of the bigger pieces of like federal legislation, like the Endangered Species Act, the Animal Welfare Act, just by those names alone, a lot of folks think, oh yeah, these are really big laws that are protecting all kinds of animals, which is really just not true. The frameworks we have in place are pretty minimal for a lot of what animal advocates want the world to look like. And so I think definitely we all kind of acknowledge already that we are at a disadvantage in terms of advocating for these types of laws to be put in place. And part of that is the educational piece of talking to legislators and saying, actually, there really isn't enough of a framework here, as was illuminated today during the legal frameworks panel, but also saying there are ways that other types of laws, environmental laws, consumer protection laws, there is a lot of overlap here. And so trying to keep in mind, we aren't starting from ground zero, but at the same time, there is a lot of work to be done. So I think definitely that education piece that we've already talked about is kind of the main point for me, for sure.
Yeah, I think Miranda addressed that really well. I mean, speaking as a scientist, if we knew everything, I'd be out of a job, because my job is to find out, the answers to questions that we don't know. And typically that's not as easy as just having one experiment, particularly on something as difficult as is the animal sentient. In this field, I think it generally involves sort of decades of work and coming at the problem from multiple different angles and just trying to build slowly and painstakingly a case for sentience. And that's kind of how it's worked for mammals. It's also how the kind of question of decapod and cephalopod sentience came onto DEFRA's radar, because lots of brilliant researchers have been doing that. So how do we deal with uncertainty? I mean, pump money into these questions, time, resources. There's a lot of work going on at the moment on, for example, humane slaughter methods for both decapods and cephalopods. And those are areas which we highlighted in our report as huge evidence gaps. So that work is being done. But yeah, I think it's just that to highlight, like Miranda was saying, to bring attention to lawmakers potentially where resources need to be allocated, because often it's in research to address these questions. It's to actually be able to answer them. You can't just necessarily get a panel of experts to review the existing literature if that literature is very patchy. So we try to deal with uncertainty as well as possible. And I think one of the kind of big points of our report is that it didn't just kind of say this is definitely the case based on this study, but looked at some kind of confidence levels and so on. But yeah, ultimately, I think it's just funding research and spending time doing it.
Thank you. And I think that's probably all the time that we have. So I'll let folks reach out to you individually for additional questions. I want to thank everyone for attending the webinar today, but obviously a special thanks to Miranda and Andrew for joining us and sharing their insights, which were so helpful. As I said, people can post questions to them or to us, and we'll get it to them. So we're going to shift now. We're going to have a break for our community partners Facebook Live, and I'll put that in the chat in just a minute. So we're going to have our community partners, Veggies Do It Better and Animal Rights Collective Portland, are going to do a lunch break live news sort of interview. Chelsea V. Davis will be interviewing Mackenzie DeVito, who's CEO of No Bones Beach Club, as she makes food, right? So part of our conversation is how can we make differences? And so she's going to show how she's making a difference by making non-animal based food that she's calling coastal inspired. So we'll be able to see how she does that. And she'll also be talking about making the switch from being a restaurant owner to a plant-based seafood line producer and how she's doing that. And then Chelsea will share some information about the 30 by 30 campaign and ways that we can encourage our governments worldwide to protect oceans to help on all these issues we've been talking about. And then after that, we'll be back on the same link starting at 1 o'clock for the Power of Alternatives panel with Ashley Kirk of Planted Foods and Matthew DeGruder of Next Level Burger. So again, thanks to everyone. I'll put the link in the chat. It's also on our website. And we'll look forward to seeing folks shortly. Thanks, everyone.